שלום, שלום.
שלום, שלום, מה נשמע?
בסדר, ברוכה השבה לפודקאסט שלנו, ההפיכה השקטה.
הפיכה שקטה.
כן,
מה זה?
אנחנו
שקט?
בחודשי הקיץ, לא שקט כמו שקיווינו, יש הרבה בלגנים בחוץ. היום אולי ניקח איזה צעד אחורה ונסתכל על דברים קצת מבחוץ.
כן, ניקח איזה חופשה מסביב לעולם. לפני כמה זמן הייתה לנו את הפרופסורית היפנית, היום אנחנו נארח שופט מכהן, מבית המשפט בפנסילבניה, בית המשפט
העליון של פנסילבניה.
בית המשפט העליון בפנסילבניה, ונשמע מה קורה בארצות הברית.
השיטה שם שונה לחלוטין, לגמרי, וננסה להבין קצת מהדברים, מהפרספקטיבה של אחותנו הגדולה שם באמריקה.
כן.
אז השופט דיוויד ווכט, נזמין אותו.
בוא נקבל.
שלום לכולם.
שלום.
יש לנו היום אורח מיוחד, עוד מעט אנחנו נעבור לאנגלית, כי היום יש לנו אורח מיוחד, וכאן אני עושה את השיפט. We have a special guest, straight from the US, Justice David Woocht, who is a serving justice at the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. And we are lucky to have him here because he is now a visiting professor at Reichman University, where he teaches US federalism and constitutional structure. So we thought that this would be a very good opportunity to try to understand what's going on in the US. So we are very lucky to have him. David, or Justice Woocht, shalom, baruch haba.
Thank you. Shalom, shalom, boker tov. It's great to be here. I am glad to talk with you and have a conversation about whatever you're interested in.
So I think it's a very rare opportunity to understand what's going on in the US, because I don't think that we're aware to the situation, the democratic backlashing situation there, which is, from my opinion, much worse than the things that's going on here in Israel. And
I'm not sure.
Let's see. Let's hear what about the topic that we're going to speak about. Like, for example, when Trump administration suing judges, or one of the judges were arrested. So we'll test it in the end. Okay? Okay. So, Judge Woocht, before Trump's presidency, how would you describe the usual relationship between the executive branch and the courts in the U.S.?
Well, the first thing that is really important, I think, for your listeners to be aware of, and they probably generally know this, but it's important to remind people about, is the U.S., as Yaniv mentioned, is a federal system. So the design of our Constitution was to have dual sovereigns. So there's the national sovereign, the United States, but remember, the United States is a plural. It's states, plural. They united to form the United States. So there were already these 13 separate sovereigns, right? Now 50 of them, 50 states. So we have dual sovereignty. We have state sovereignty, which came first, and then we have the national sovereignty. So this system is a vertical balance of powers to go along with the horizontal balance of powers with which people are familiar, the legislative, executive, and judicial. So you asked about the executive and the judicial, I believe, and the system was designed by Hamilton Madison et al. to constantly have a creative tension, a struggle, a nonviolent struggle, but a struggle nonetheless between the branches, so that no one branch could get too powerful at the expense of the others, and that's the dynamic that operates in the United States, and it operates in each state as well, and then between the state governments and the national government. Again, I know you asked about the executive and the judicial, and this is not the first time in American history, when there's been a struggle between the judicial branch and the executive branch. For example, think of things that occurred during the Nixon administration. There was the United States versus Nixon case, the Watergate tapes case. And then, of course, there was the struggle between the Nixon administration and the Congress. You might remember the Watergate hearings and that sort of thing. So the system in the United States is it's not an accident that that you see a constant struggle and tension between the branches, almost regardless of who the various personalities are. It's a remarkably resilient system. I think, and this is something we could talk about, that as the years go by, the more it occurs to me that it's the Constitution that has kept the United States together. Because it's extremely hard for an empire, a transcontinental empire of that vast size, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Mexico to Canada, 340 million people or whatever it is, to stay together. And what is it that keeps it together? It's the Constitution, I think, more than anything else.
So we'll get to the Constitution in a second and to some of the tensions you've mentioned, but I'm actually interested in one aspect that you've mentioned, and that is the vertical separation of powers between the, let's say, the federal state and the sub-federal states.
Yes.
We don't have it in Israel. Israel is one area without such a separation of powers. Can you give us an example of how this check or vertical check works? I mean, can you give us an example that's something, let's say, that the president wanted and the governors in the states managed to block?
Yes. So the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that any powers not assigned to the national government by the Constitution or by laws passed pursuant to the Constitution remains with the states or the people themselves. So that it's a really important principle, and it's not common in the world that the national government in the United States is a government of limited powers. And that's why when you go to court in the United States, or you meet with a lawyer or a judge in the United States, it's almost always going to be a state court or a state judge. So that the vast majority of legal matters arise in the United States in the state courts. There are more judges in the state of California alone than there are in the entire federal system. So you asked about an example. Well, one example that's coming up right now is the executive branch nationally, the presidential administration, has the president has said something about wanting to eliminate mail-in ballots. We have many of the states have passed laws allowing for people to vote by mail. Mm-hmm. I know you don't have that here, but it's something in the most recent years that some states have, and the some of the governors and other people have responded that this is a matter for the states to decide. This is a very interesting issue because under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the Congress of the United States does have the authority, if it wishes, to legislate in the area of election law, the federal elections. But absent affirmative action by the Congress, it's left to the states to set up their own system. So when you go to vote in the United States, even when you're voting for president or United States senator or United States representative, you're voting in an operation that is structured according to the law of that state. So you really have a mosaic of systems around the country on how elections are done. And it's up to individual states whether they want to have voting by whether they want to allow voting by mail or not. And if they do, whether they'd like to have early voting, how far in advance of election day. So you really, it's often a surprise to a lot of people around the world to realize just how much disparity you have in the United States, not just in election law, in a variety of areas, in most areas. This is consistent with something that Louis Brandeis, the first Jew to serve on the United States Supreme Court, wrote about a century ago or more, he wrote that the states are free to be the laboratories of democracy, to experiment. And it may be that something a state does is only good for that state because of its culture, because of its history, because of its people, or its circumstances. But it also may be that one of these experiments that is done in a state turns out to be very successful and a good idea, and then maybe other states and maybe the Congress end up adopting it.
You mentioned before that there was always kind of a tension between the administrative branch, the judiciary system, but when you look back to the past, can you compare to another times or another situation that's similar to this current situation?
I think that it's easy to catastrophize our moment. I think that we always, we in the United States and perhaps in other countries as well, tend to think it's never been so bad and the world is coming to an end. Maybe it is, but I think that that throughout the United States history, there have been enormous crises that have arisen. Of course, not existential crises at all times like Israel has had for its entire history. But the U.S. has the luxury of being a transcontinental empire with essentially peaceful neighbors north and south, and then oceans on the east and west. It's a great circumstance of luck that Americans tend to forget when they try to dictate to other countries, including Israel, how to make national security decisions and other decisions of great import. But I think, coming back to your question, I think the short answer is yes. There have been many other crises in American history, periods of crisis that have been huge. The Civil War, for example, the last war fought on American soil was truly an existential battle, and could easily have gone the other way. The country could have been split in two. The period around World War I, when there were, and shortly thereafter, when there were enormous incursions on the values of free speech embedded in the U.S. Constitution. In fact, much of our free speech tradition stems from the courageous majority opinions and dissents of Holmes and Brandeis during the immediate post-war years after World War I. There were the Palmer raids and various pressures on essential liberties. Then, of course, we had the Great Depression, into which my father was born, when many people were living on the streets in America. Then, of course, the Second World War, which was not fought on American soil, but nonetheless was a significant struggle, obviously. Then we had the McCarthy era, when people were prosecuted and persecuted for their political beliefs. Many people were blacklisted, including many Jewish directors and screenwriters in Hollywood. And then, of course, the turbulent 1960s. So it's an ebb and a flow.
Yeah.
We have.
But it's not the same situation, because when I asked about comparing the situation, it was like in a specific perspective of the democratic institution.
Yes.
When you review all the crises that you just mentioned,
yes,
do you think that they would look different? They could look different if the democratic institution and the judiciary system was weaker? Because when you see segregation,
yes,
for example, women's rights
yes,
on themselves, to vote, the right to vote for African American people.
yes.
Do you think that in all those crises, if the institution, the democratic institution, was weaker, you think that it could look different?
I think that various points in American history, the judiciary has been the last bastion of freedom and democracy. We've known since Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion in Marbury versus Madison that it's the province of the judiciary to say what the law is. And I give a PowerPoint. In fact, I'm going to talk today with my Reichman law students about the rule of law and judicial independence. And I'm going to talk about some of the times when the rule of law was defied. Andrew Jackson, when he was president, defied the rule of law. Abraham Lincoln defied the rule of law. There was significant reason, you mentioned desegregation, there was significant reason to doubt whether Dwight Eisenhower, when he was president, would enforce the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, ordering desegregation of the public schools. But Eisenhower, having been a general, understood the importance of civilian control of the military, and he sent the National Guard to Little Rock to desegregate the schools. So it is constantly the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is. And of course, as Hamilton wrote, the judiciary has neither the purse, which the Congress has, nor the sword, which the president has, but only judgment. And it's critical that, as Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, that the whole power of the state will be brought forth if necessary to enforce the court's decrees.
Judge Wוכט, I want to ask, maybe to explain to our audience, maybe more generally about the current situation, and how do you see now the relationship between the executive or the President Trump and the judiciary? About the tension, about various proposals maybe to change courts' authority. We've heard about that probably now famous case in the U.S. Supreme Court, basically saying that Trump has some kind of a immunity, speaking about the rule of law, right? So he's above the law in a way. How do you see now the relationship between the current Supreme Court and Trump?
So it's emphatically, it's a foundational principle that nobody's above the law. The president is not above the law, of course. I think it's been fairly well settled that presidents, and this goes back to the Nixon era, presidents will not be subject to criminal process during their presidency, or certain matters must wait till the end of their term. I'm not completely current on the state of the jurisprudence on that. We saw permutations of this during the Nixon and Clinton presidencies. Of course, Donald Trump's legal problems were associated with matters in New York, in the state of New York system. And he has a matter under appeal in the New York state courts right now. You may be inquiring about the dispute involving Mr. Garcia and the deportation. And again, that's in the federal system. I'm not really fully conversant with the details, but here again, the principle is that nobody's above the law. And if a court orders a president to do something, it's the same as if the court orders a layperson or anybody to do something. The court orders have to be followed.
But I don't want to take us to the Supreme Court, because if one reads law review articles, etc., there is a sense that the U.S. Supreme Court is in a certain crisis of legitimacy. I know there are various proposals to change the way the Supreme Court works, maybe to adopt a certain supermajority in order to invalidate legislation. We know that many laws in the last few years have been invalidated on the margin of 5 versus 4, and we know that the court is very polarized. So from your perspective as an American jurist, do you sense a certain crisis of legitimacy or no?
I think that there are periods when the court is brought into the limelight more than at other periods. During the 1930s, we had the court packing crisis when Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to pack the court. He developed a proposal advanced by his congressional allies to provide that for every justice who passed the age of 70, a new seat would be created, so it would create more. He was a measure that he advanced in order to react to the frustrations he had with his legislative initiatives failing in the Supreme Court. Ultimately, there was what was called the switch in time that saved 9 when Justice Owen Roberts...
It was the New Deal, right?
This was during the New Deal. When Owen Roberts changed his mind in a major case, and thereafter FDR's New Deal initiatives had more success when challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, why do I say that? Because, interestingly, and a lot of people don't focus on this, under Article 3 of the United States Constitution, there are very few restrictions in detail on the nature and parameters of the federal courts. What do I mean by that? So, the Article 3 of the United States Constitution provides that there will be a Supreme Court. It does not specify the size of the Supreme Court. It does not specify anything other than they're confirmed by the Senate, appointed by the president, that the Senate will advise and consent, which has been interpreted to mean the confirmation process with which you're familiar. And it says that they shall serve on good behavior, which, consistent with the way Hamilton saw it in the Federalist Papers, has been interpreted to mean essentially life, or as long as they want to serve, unless impeached. So beyond that, though, there are really Article 3 is very brief. So that's why, going to your question, there have been periodically, as there are now, various proposals, many of which would pass constitutional muster probably, and some of which might not. If, for example, if Congress passed and the president signed a law saying that there will be staggered terms, terms of a 15-year duration or something like that, non-renewable, or various other measures. There have been proposals, for example, to take to deal with the good behavior provision, to set up an arrangement, and Professor Akhil Amar at Yale Law School has been associated with this proposal in some measure, I believe, as well as other people, that you would have sort of a rotation system where these justices would ride circuit, as it were, in the courts of appeals for a time, so that they would have life tenure essentially, albeit moving around the system and not always on the Supreme Court. There are the number of different proposals. They're all interesting, but here's what I want to say is, first of all, it would require an act of Congress, which, as you know, requires then a presidential approval with the whole veto arrangement. And number two, even if passed pursuant to the legislative process, it would have to survive the inevitable court challenge. So it's like we often hear, after all is said and done, a whole lot more is said than done.
But in that case, because I already know if this happened in Israel, people would say, the court is in a conflict of interest. How can the court judge on rules that concern its own authority? How do you respond to that?
An excellent question. And the short answer is what's called the rule of necessity. So in some cases, now, of course, in cases involving discrete members of a court, of course, those individual members can recuse themselves, as all of us do from time to time. But in a circumstance where there's sort of an institutional question, like the one to which you refer, the rule of necessity might apply, by which somebody has to decide it. And if there's no higher authority, it'll fall to the court to make that decision. Of course, each individual jurist has to satisfy their own conscience that they can, decide the matter objectively. But ultimately, there is no higher authority in the United States system than the United States Supreme Court. It sort of connects with the various concerns that have been raised with respect to a couple of justices of the U.S. Supreme Court in recent years with respect to ethical questions, conflicts of interest asserted, and that sort of thing. They ultimately are the highest authority with respect to their own ethics standards. And anyway, I'm getting far afield, so I'll stop talking and let you ask this next question.
We were speaking about the court legitimacy, and it feels to me that there is no sense of urgent in the current situation now in the U.S., and I'll explain. The Trump administration sued judges in Maryland and filed a disciplinary complaint, and Judge Hannah Dugan in Wisconsin was arrested for allegedly assisting a defendant to avoid ICE detention. It sounds very disruptive. It's very, for me, as a person that lives in a democratic country.
Mm-hmm. So I don't want to address a specific pending case, so I'm not commenting on any individual case, but generally speaking, in the American system, judges are not immune from criminal prosecution. I could be prosecuted like anybody else for a breach of the criminal law. Mm-hmm. Again, without commenting on any specific case at all, the immigration laws they're federal laws, because under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the congressional branch is assigned the authority to pass an uniform law on naturalization, which has always been interpreted to mean that plenary power goes to the Congress. So pursuant to that, Congress, of course, has passed the various immigration laws over the years. And that's why when you talk about ICE, for example, these are federal agencies. Okay, so the states don't have their own little immigration authority. So when you...
But did it happen before?
Did judges get arrested for allegedly thwarting federal... I'm not aware.
Not specific in the immigration case.
Yeah.
But is it happened before that justice were arrested in the past?
Yes.
Not because of something that connecting to their profession.
Okay, right. So here's an important distinction. Again, speaking generally and without reference to specific cases, judges can be arrested in the United States like anybody else for violating the criminal law. We don't wear some shield that makes us, immune from abiding by the law of the land like everybody else. If I'm speeding down the highway, I can be, given a ticket. If I hit somebody over the head, I can be arrested, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we don't have in the United States is a system by which the executive branch can arrest judges for their decisions. But the example that you're asking about is an example. I will treat it as a hypothetical example where a judge is alleged to have assisted in the obstruction of justice. Okay, again, by hypothesis, let's say that Yaniv is a fugitive. Okay, and I know that. And I know, Vered, that you are a law enforcement officer and you're tracking him, you're trying to apprehend him. And I use this again, purely hypothetical, I use my authority as a judge to find a way to get him to evade you and escape your capture, okay? I could be arrested for that. Again, it would have to be proven. I might have good defenses. It may be a bogus allegation, but the suggestion that I am immune from the consequences of my action is not one consistent with the American judicial system.
And what do you think about the Maryland case?
I'm not aware of the Maryland case, and I wouldn't comment on a specific case if I were. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that. I was born in Maryland, by the way, but
right.
I'm not aware of the specific Maryland case. Would not comment on it.
Okay, so we won't speak about this specific case, but what do you think, and if you can feel it, is there any impact from these two specific cases on the independence of the judiciary?
So, or if I can just add to that, I mean, is there a sense within state judges, some kind of a threat, or do you feel that there's a certain change in your judicial independence?
These are good questions, and the answer is absolutely not. To be a judge, you have to have some Batsim. You have to you have to be always courageous. I don't care what people think, if they like my decision or not. When I studied for the bar exam, one of the professors said, he was teaching criminal law, and he said, remember, don't love them, don't hate them, just hose them. And I thought it sounded funny, so I laughed, but I didn't really understand what he meant until I became a judge many years later. He was saying, don't get emotionally invested. Just apply the law remorselessly. You're not there to give this guy a medal, and you're not there to smite him with a flaming sword. You're just there to apply the law. And if there's ever a situation where for some reason you can't do that objectively, that's a case you need to recuse yourself from. And the important thing in response to your question is, a judge, whatever they're state or federal, a trial judge or an appellate judge, you can't be afraid of criticism. People are going to be out there. I mean, who knows what they're saying on social media? Who cares? Like, I don't need to worry. I don't worry about whether a decision I make is popular or it makes somebody happy or makes somebody sad or makes somebody angry. It's just not my, I don't care. And the minute I start listening to that is the minute I should resign my job.
So that's super interesting. And by the way, I'm sure you're already aware that the sentence on the Batsim will be the sync for the
good.
Episode.
Yeah, good. I wanted to add a little color for your Israeli audience.
Good, but to take it in a more serious note, maybe the audience doesn't know that, but you as a justice of the Supreme Court, you were elected by a popular vote of the people.
Correct. Now, Pennsylvania, we're elected at all levels. The other states are different.
Okay, so each state has its own system.
Exactly. This is important.
But how does this correspond with the notion that you say, I don't care about what the people think. Mm-hmm. If you're as a judge, you're supposed to stand for popular elections.
Yes.
Does not affect how you act as a judge?
It's an excellent question, and it's a question that I get asked. And the answer is, I don't need the job. I love the job. I want the job. But if the people replace me, I'll still make a living. My wife would prefer that I go out and make some more money, but I love the job, and I convinced her to let me try to keep it. If the people decide otherwise, the people decide otherwise. It is a frequent criticism of an elected judiciary that we must seek popular support, that we must raise money for campaigns. These are valid criticisms. Of course, there are criticisms the other way, that an appointed judiciary can tend to be insular, can tend to favor elites, can tend to eventuate in people becoming judges who haven't been out among the people, who don't know every nook and cranny of their jurisdiction like we do. I mean, when you campaign, you know, if take me, for example, I've been to every corner of Pennsylvania. We have 13 million citizens, and I've been everywhere in Pennsylvania. So I know the places and the people, the communities about which I'm deciding cases. So there are competing claims. Ultimately, the system that each state within the United States, each of the 50 states, is going to have under its own state constitution is a function of what the people of that state want. Because remember, a constitution is we the people. It's the foundational document. So the people of Pennsylvania never lost their Jacksonian impulse when, you know, in the era of Andrew Jackson and thereafter, this populist wave swept the country and resulted in many states changing their judiciary to an elected one. Many of them, perhaps most of them, reverted to an appointed or partially appointed judiciary. Pennsylvania never did. If the people of Pennsylvania chose, they could, of course, change it. They could change it to something that looks like the federal system, even, you know, with life tenure. The only state that has essentially life tenure throughout, as far as I know, is Rhode Island.
Okay. So do you think the system that the public is electing the justice in a polarized society, it's fit for this kind of studies?
If I understood your question correctly, you raise an interesting point that, and if this is not where you were headed, just tell me and I'll okay. change gears. But the atmosphere in American politics is highly polarized on a partisan nature. And a big challenge these days is that many people, both politicians and also just citizens, see judges as an extension of the political system, and we're not. We don't play in politics. We don't decide cases on political grounds. We're interpreting the law, and it is really important when invited to speak to audiences about judicial independence and the rule of law. I believe that judges go out and speak about this point, that we are not partisan actors, because I think it's especially in an era when children no longer learn civics education. I'm talking about the United States, not Israel. Children don't get the same education about the system of government that they used to, and with social media, so many people get their news from social media. It becomes more important for judges to take it upon themselves to familiarize citizens with the nature of our system, and that we are not political actors. Even if we get the job through political means, as we do in Pennsylvania. So it is, you know, I don't want to be Pollyannish or, you know, duck the important issue or challenge that you're raising, which is that it is a political environment, at least in Pennsylvania, that germinates the judiciary, you know, that in which people are selected for the bench. But once getting to the bench, one has to be mature enough and self-aware enough to understand that's not your job to be, just like it's not your job to be emotionally involved or, you know, pick a winner from the start. Yeah. It's also not your job to be a partisan crusader. And it's a question of, you know, intellectual maturity and self-awareness. Yeah,
I'm sure. But now when we speak about this atmosphere in the U.S., when the president use rhetorics like political or judicial coup to the justice. How can you justify the fact that you're trying to reflect to the audience or to the public that you're not a politician, but in the other hand, the president called you and give you this label?
Well,
let me just add here is something also we see now in Israel, right? There's a sense that, the executive looks at the judiciary and then tells the base, his political base, look at them, they're all politicians, they're acting as if they're judges. Basically, it's all about politics.
But it's in addition to the fact that they're elected by the public as well. So he's like a politician. So why Trump is wrong?
So, first of all, I wouldn't care about if Mr. Trump chose to say something about me. He's got bigger fish to fry. He's not going to say anything about me one way or another. If anybody, at any level of state or national politics wants to comment on judges, that's their right. I mean, people can say whatever they want. And in the United States, when you're a public figure, which doesn't have to mean you're famous. It can just be when you're an elected official, you are, as a matter of law, a public figure. So people have greater latitude in the kind of things they can say about you without civil liability. So, if you're going to step up and seek elected or appointed office in the American systems, whether state or federal, you can't have a thin skin and think you're going to be above criticism. People are fully entitled to We want a system in the United States where our leaders are subject to criticism, and they are very robust criticism. It doesn't have to be gentle or intelligent. Holmes and Brandeis, who I mentioned earlier, and Holmes in particular, wrote about the marketplace of ideas. We don't respond to a bad idea by trying to shut it down. We let that bad idea get rebutted with good ideas. Now, I'm not naive. I understand, social media provides a megaphone, and there are challenges that we haven't faced before, because of social media. It was, I don't know if it was Churchill or who said that a lie is halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its pants on, right? And now with social media, it's gone around the world several times. But these are challenges with which we live, and I think it's important to maintain the presence of mind not to panic, because again, as I said before, I think in every generation we have felt this is the greatest crisis. There's never been a greater one, and then tomorrow comes around, and lo and behold, there's a bigger crisis.
Yeah, tell it to us Israelis. We know exactly what you mean.
Yes.
I want to take us a bit towards the end to the maybe similarities or differences between the Israeli system and the US system. Because when our government tried to push forward with its big reform, the judicial overhaul in early 2023, and still continues to do so by other means, so changing the way judges are selected, enacting an override clause, limiting judicial review, etc., one of the claims was, don't panic, what do you want? This is not an attack on democracy. We simply want to be like the US. Look, the US also, the politicians select the judges to the Supreme Court. So, okay, also in Israel, the politicians will select the judges. This will not undermine judicial independence in any way. We simply want to be like the US. How do you respond to such a claim, and how do you see the differences between the structures?
So the first thing I want to emphasize is I want to be humble here and not be one of these Americans who tells Israel what it should do. You're a sovereign country. You have your own problems, your own circumstance. It's a totally separate issue. I think, Israel's only, the third Commonwealth is only 77 years old. So, you're having growing pains. That's to be expected. About this long after its independence, the United States had a civil war, right? So you have not had a civil war. And so every nation is expected to have growing pains. As I was saying to you before we got started, we all recognize that a special challenge for Israel is the absence of a constitution. And of course, the United States was blessed shortly after its founding to have a period of relative peace to be able to draft and then to ratify a constitution, as well as a remarkable founding generation that was, socially fairly homogeneous in order to come to agreement despite its differences on a founding document. As I said earlier, I think that founding document is perhaps the greatest thing that's kept the United States together through all the turbulent times. Now, you did not get a constitution here. You were fighting for your lives and bringing in hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world and providing for their survival and sustenance. So now the moment has passed, and it's exceptionally difficult, as I see it, to have a constitution. And one of the challenges of legitimacy is when a court speaks about the Constitution, but there is no Constitution. So I'm somewhat familiar with the Barak, the revolution, and he was one of my teachers at Yale Law School. And so I'm generally aware of some of the criticisms that have been advanced, and of course the problem with the basic laws that they only require a majority of the people voting in the Knesset that day. Also, because you're a parliamentary system, your executive and legislative branches are conflated, which also is a complicating factor. Now, England also doesn't have a constitution, the UK, but they've also been around for hundreds of years and have a common law tradition. So
and they have two houses.
And they have two houses, and they have their fancy law lords with funny white wigs. But
they're still subordinated to the European Court of Human Rights.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother issue than the supranational issue. But I do think that whatever happens here, and that'll be up to Israelis, not Americans or Europeans, heaven forbid, you'll decide how to move forward, and you'll decide it, without battles in the streets, and then the nation will survive. I do think that just because it's exceptionally difficult to adopt a constitution doesn't mean that further attempts should not be made. Another issue I wanted to mention is I do think whatever happens that the Supreme Court of Israel and the people who are talking about how to structure things here should be taking a serious look at this High Court of Justice template, because having no standing requirements is, I think, really problematic. It used to be before a century ago in the United States.
So the right to stand before the High Court.
Yeah, and I understand there's a history here on how that happened, and of course you had the Ottoman period before that and everything, but the United States, in the United States before the 1920s, anybody could appeal matters all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and it was very difficult situation. And after the reforms of the 1920s legislation, it went to a mostly discretionary docket. So basically, I think that your system is in a period of evolution, and that people shouldn't panic. They should take measured discussion and undertake whatever reforms appear most sensible. And I hope that the temperature of the discussion could be reduced, and that Israelis could come to some kinds of agreeable compromises on reforming your system, because your system is very it's very immature. I think your judicial system is it's there are some serious problems with the way your system is set up. Again, selection of judges, standing, this High Court of Justice thing, the citation of a constitution which doesn't exist, this basic law thing. So I think there are real problems, and then you have this attorney general you have an attorney general and a justice minister, and then you have also a situation where even I think at the brigade level, you have lawyers who are telling field commanders what you don't have that in the United States. So you have a lot of things here, which I think probably are triggering the people who are advancing the reforms, and perhaps there's an overreaction. And, it's like anything in life. You have a reaction, and then you have a counter reaction, and then people on both sides get angry, and then eventually everybody's forgotten that we're all here to try to discuss the best way forward. So I hope you can get there. It's very complicated. I do think you do need to make some improvements here. I'm glad that I'm not the one that has to get it done.
Of course, but when the problem that you just mentioned, when you're reviewing the reforms that was offered by the Likud and the ניסיונותיו, do you think that this is the solution when we have no constitution, no two houses, when their main goal is to make one authority? Do you think the reform is the solution?
Oh, I don't profess a view. It's your country. I'm just a visitor, and I'm not going to tell you what your solution is. I do think you need some changes, but what they're going to be ultimately, it's up to you. I think obviously the environment is very heated, and obviously then you have a war in the middle, an ongoing war. So it's extremely complicated. I'm not being critical. I mean, what you've achieved here, in every sphere is amazing. No country could have done what Israelis have done in the midst of constant war and constant struggle. I know my relatives told me about, that when they had ration cards in the 1950s, and you've never had a moment's peace in this country, and look at what you've achieved. So I think it's important for Israelis to take a deep breath and realize that you've created something amazing, and it's getting more amazing every day. And you will get through this judicial reform crisis, and it's a growing pain. Like this struggle over how to structure your judiciary, it's a growing pain. It is. Don't get me wrong. You have a deep problem, the fact that you don't have a constitution. Let me give you an example. When I was in the seminar with Justice Barak and two Yale law professors way back in the 1980s, and I was sitting there, it was a real privilege for me because I was just one of like 9 students with these 3 remarkable guys. And the two law professors and Justice Barak would talk about their ideas. But when the two law professors would give their crazy ideas about due process clause, there was actually a due process clause. But when Justice Barak would give his ideas, he didn't have a due process clause. It was just what he thought. Okay? So again, it doesn't mean that his ideas are not brilliant. They are, right? But there's no there. So I hope that, I don't think it's going to be possible anytime soon, but I think it would be great if somehow, like that effort by the late Professor Gavison and that man she did that draft constitution with, or that somehow a constitution could be done. Why? Because it's the foundational document. It's the so when legislation is struck down on the basis that it violates the Constitution, that's a concept with which we've been comfortable or accepting of back to Marbury versus Madison, and before that to Federalist Paper number 78. But when the Israeli Supreme Court strikes something down as, quote, unconstitutional, unquote, there's a legitimacy issue because there is no constitution. And when they strike it down because it violates a basic law, it still has a challenge because it's just a majority of the people that were in the Knesset that day. So again, I don't question anybody's motives. I mean, everybody has the best of intentions to try to make the system the best that it can be according to their opinion. But it is an immature system, and by that I don't mean to give it an insult. It's a 77-year-old nation, going back for thousands of years, but 77 years this time around, and it's going to take some time.
I want to tell you why it's super interesting to hear this perspective. This reminds me about 2 years ago, I had the privilege to host Justice Breyer from the Supreme Court here in Israel, and we held a conference with him. And over dinner, we told him about this case where the Israeli Supreme Court basically can review basic laws themselves and strike them down if they violate the core values of the state as Jewish and democratic. Now, on the one hand, it sounded fascinating. How can it be that the court strikes down a basic law? On the other hand, once he realized that you can enact a basic law with a simple majority of 2 versus 1, then it obviously makes sense. So towards the end, can you give us, I know you were humble and say you don't want to give us advice on our constitution-making process, but maybe 1 or 2 elements that you think are super useful in the American context that we should look into and adopt. I mean, I know that the U.S., let's say, rigidity, the almost inability to amend the Constitution is one of the advantages, but also the disadvantages of the U.S. Constitutional structure. It's almost impossible to amend the Constitution. Are there any features that you think this could be a good option for you Israelis to look and maybe adopt or follow? You can have some kind of variation, but
I think that it's very peculiar to an American to see that justices of the Supreme Court participate in picking members of that court. I know you have this committee structure, and there are justices, and there are Chavrei Knesset, and there are bar association, and I understand an effort was being made to try to, draw some wide participation in this process, but there's a self-perpetuation that can go on when you have. I mean, for example, I would not be comfortable with a situation where I was picking people to join my court, because my natural inclination as a human being would be, even an unconscious inclination would be to pick somebody who will replicate my jurisprudence or who will join my opinions. And that to me is... But
also to the lower courts, if you would participate in a committee that would select judges to the lower courts in Pennsylvania, because this would be the more equivalent example.
I think that's a good clarification. I do think that I have to confess, it's so foreign to me to think that the judiciary is appointing or participating in appointing members of the judiciary again, but we have this tripartite system. Mm-hmm. We have a separation of the executive and legislative branches, and I'm not an authority or particularly familiar with the parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, and this is interesting, it at least by hypothesis, the parliament is supreme, right? So, that's why when we studied law, right, and we read these British cases, we'd always read the decisions made by the law lords, right? And the principle there is parliamentary supremacy, such that the parliament can overrule the law lords. Like if the three of us were law lords, right, in the House of Lords, and we made a decision, it was always the British law that you could go to the full House of Lords and get that overruled, right? So this is the basic idea of a parliamentary system, and I think it's a problem as a matter of principle that and I think it's probably part of the reason why the United States was structured under its Constitution to separate those branches. So I don't really have a magic solution. I do think that you need some kind of constitutional reform. I'm glad I'm not the one to have to get it done.
Yes, but if you had the opportunity to put some ground set of principle for our
Grundnorm.
For our future constitution, What kind of principle? You said it
Well,
will
see,
be the most important.
You're tempting me to be the evil American who comes in and just says, "Well, just do it our way." You know, like I'm not going to do that because you know you're halfway around the world. You're in a really nasty neighborhood. You fight for your survival.
But when we're looking inside to Israel, we want to keep Israel at the democratic, liberal country.
Sure,
which is very important. And we're part of the same community, the Western democratic states.
Right.
So we share the same values. So
Yes.
if someone will ask you one day, our next prime minister, this current prime minister, help me to set 4 principles that will keep Israel liberal,
Make Israel great again?
Exactly.
Yeah.
MIGA? I think trying to adopt a constitution
But what
elements
it will contain?
a constitution is not the aim in itself. The constitution is a means to achieve something, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of elements you say this is something that you must have in a constitution, like a Bill of Rights or something like, I don't know.
Well, yeah, a Bill of Rights. Obviously, yours would not include an establishment clause because here it's not just a democratic state, it's a Jewish democratic state with guaranteed rights for minorities, obviously.
So just to explain that, in the U.S., the Constitution basically establishes a separation between state and church.
Yes, it's always been viewed as a separation of church and state, although recent jurisprudence in the United States Supreme Court has eroded the wall of separation. It's a whole other subject to some extent. I think that when I look at some of the rhetoric on both sides or all sides of your debate about judicial reform, some of it's, you know, irresponsible. Some of it is, you know, just really very unreflective. Some of the remarks made by members of Knesset on all sides are just, you know, they're just uneducated about the judicial system on all sides. And that's what I mean. I think you're in growing. It sounds condescending for me to say it, but since you're asking, I think you're in a period of evolution, and that's to be the United States. The United States had fistfights. Had a member of the U.S. House, Congressman Brooks, beat a U.S. Senator Charles Sumner with a cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate in the lead up to the Civil War. So it's not surprising that a country in its early decades has growing pains. It's just, but you're just going to have to work this out at some point. Again, I think the absence of a constitution is your single biggest problem in that regard. And of course, as the Haredi population grows, the ability to ratify a constitution becomes more and more difficult.
Judge Vekt, so we hope that next time you're here, we'll already have either a draft constitution or even a fully one enacted. We thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. וואו, רעיון ממש ממש מעניין.
ממש מעניין.
ממש.
קודם כל זה נחמד, אני חושב, לשמוע דברים מזווית של מישהו שופט מכהן, אבל בערכאה נמוכה בפנסילבניה, כלומר בתוך מדינה, לא בבית המשפט העליון הפדרלי, כל זווית הראייה היא שונה, ואני חושב שזה מאוד חשוב גם לצופים שלנו, לפתוח את הראש, לשמוע קצת דברים אחרים. אני חושב שאחד מהדברים החשובים שאני לוקח מהשיחה הזאת, זה קודם כל באמת את הצניעות שהוא אמר, אתם תעצבו לעצמכם.
זה מאוד גישה האמריקאית.
נכון, לא בהכרח להעתיק ממקומות אחרים, וכל אחד יש לו את התפיסה שלו לפי אורך החיים, לפי התרבות, לפי מה שהציבור רוצה, ואני חושב שזה לק אחד מאוד חשוב. הדבר השני זה באמת למנוע את מה שאנחנו קוראים לו בספרות הפרנקנסטייט. אי אפשר להסתכל על ארצות הברית ולהגיד, תראו מה קורה בבית המשפט העליון האמריקאי, ניקח רק את זה כי זה נותן עכשיו כוח לממשלה, בלי לקחת את יתר המרכיבים, שזה שלטון פדרלי עם הפרדת רשויות אנכית, וכמובן חוקה נוקשה עם מגילת זכויות והפרדת דת ומדינה. כלומר, יש כל כך הרבה מרכיבים אחרים בארצות הברית, שאי אפשר להסתכל על משהו אחד ולהגיד, זה הולך טוב באמריקה, בואי ניקח את זה.
נכון, כמו שהיה לנו לפני 2 פרקים, שרוטמן היה פה ודיבר על זה שהציבור, העם בעצם צריך לבחור את השופטים, אז יכול להיות שהעם צריך לבחור את השופטים, אבל יש לנו עוד כמה דברים בדרך להשלים, בשביל שנוכל להגיע למצב הזה ולשמור על ישראל דמוקרטית. אני חושבת זה פרק משלים לפרק הקודם שהיה לנו עם חברת הכנסת רייטן, שדיברנו על היום של אחרי. על מה הכי חשוב פה. חוקה, סט ערכים כולל שמקובל על כולם, ולאט לאט הפודקאסט הופך מהפיכה משטרית נוראית, למה בעצם אנחנו בונים פה?
לבנייה מחדש. כן, אני חושב שהמסר של חוקה הוא מאוד חשוב. אין ספק שאחת מהמטרות המרכזיות לדעתי של הממשלה הבאה, שנקווה שהיא תהיה רחבה ושפויה ומתונה, יהיה להסדיר פה אחת ולתמיד את כללי המשחק, מגילת זכויות, אלה הדברים שבלעדיהם לא נצליח לשרוד כמדינה יהודית ודמוקרטית.
וליברלית. תודה רבה.
תודה ורד.